Susan Rohde seemed to have it all. A successful husband, a happy family, and a comfortable life. But behind closed doors, a darker reality was unfolding. What drove this mother of three to her breaking point, and how did a family man become a convicted killer? Born in South Africa in 1969, Susan's life appeared picture perfect. She was married to Jason Rohde, a high-flying businessman who climbed the corporate ladder to become CEO of a major real estate company. Their three daughters completed the image of a thriving, happy family. From the outside, the Rohdes had it all: success, wealth, and domestic bliss. But appearances can be deceiving. In February 2016, cracks began to show in this perfect facade. Susan discovered Jason's infidelity, a betrayal that shattered her world and sent her spiraling into depression. This revelation marked the beginning of a tragic chain of events that would ultimately lead to Susan's untimely death. Despite the outward appearance of success and happiness, the Rohde family was facing serious internal issues that would soon come to light, forever changing their lives and exposing the dark underbelly of their seemingly perfect existence. As the truth of Jason's infidelity came to light, the Rohdes' picture-perfect life began to crumble. In a desperate attempt to salvage their marriage, Susan and Jason turned to counseling. But even in this therapeutic setting, Jason's deception continued. He initially denied the affair, further eroding Susan's already fragile trust. It wasn't until later, when confronted with undeniable evidence, that Jason finally admitted to his infidelity. This revelation sent shockwaves through their relationship, leaving Susan grappling with intense feelings of betrayal and anxiety. Recognizing the depth of her emotional turmoil, Susan's therapist recommended she pursue individual counseling. These sessions became a lifeline for Susan, providing a safe space to process her pain and work through her conflicting emotions. Susan's experience highlights a critical issue in our society: the lack of accessible mental health resources for individuals in crisis. While Susan was fortunate to receive professional help, many others facing similar situations aren't so lucky. The importance of readily available, affordable mental health support cannot be overstated, especially for those navigating the treacherous waters of betrayal and domestic strife. As Susan struggled to cope with the aftermath of Jason's affair, their home life began to deteriorate rapidly. Arguments escalated, becoming more frequent and intense. Jason's behavior grew increasingly controlling, a red flag that often goes unrecognized in cases of domestic abuse. In one particularly revealing message to Jason, Susan expressed her frustration, writing, "I'm sick of you controlling my life." These warning signs of domestic abuse are frequently overlooked or misunderstood, not just by those closest to the situation, but by society at large. The subtle nature of emotional and psychological abuse can make it difficult to identify, leaving victims feeling isolated and unsure of how to seek help. Susan's case serves as a stark reminder of the need for greater awareness and education about the various forms of domestic abuse. Despite their attempts at reconciliation, the Rohdes' marriage continued to unravel. The couple's efforts in counseling seemed futile, as Jason's controlling behavior overshadowed any progress they might have made. Susan's messages to Jason during this time reflected her inner turmoil, revealing a woman desperate for clarity and closure, but continually met with resistance and manipulation. The failure of the Rohdes' marriage counseling exposes a significant gap in our support systems for troubled relationships. While therapy can be a powerful tool for healing, it's not always enough, especially in cases involving infidelity and emotional abuse. This raises important questions about the effectiveness of traditional counseling methods in addressing the complex dynamics of toxic relationships. As tensions in the Rohde household reached a boiling point, it became clear that the support systems in place were inadequate to address the severity of their situation. The escalating conflict between Susan and Jason serves as a sobering reminder of how quickly a relationship can deteriorate when underlying issues are not properly addressed. The annual conference for the League, Griffin and Sotheby's International Reality in July 2016 should have been a prestigious event for Jason Rohde. Instead, it became the backdrop for a tragic and violent end to his marriage. As the couple arrived at the Spear Hotel in Stellenbosch, South Africa, the tension between them was palpable. Susan's discovery of Jason's affair had shattered their family's perfect facade, and the cracks were now impossible to ignore. On the evening of July 23, after a formal dinner event, Susan sent a message to her therapist that hinted at her fragile emotional state. "I shook her hand and said, 'I hoped we didn't have to meet again,'" she wrote, referring to Jason's mistress, Jolene. Little did anyone know that these would be among Susan's final words. As the night wore on, the pressure between Susan and Jason reached a boiling point. While in the bathroom, Jason attempted to message Jolene, unaware that Susan was watching his every move. This act of betrayal sparked a heated argument that quickly spiraled out of control. Witnesses later reported hearing loud voices echoing through the hotel hallway, with Susan and Jason engaged in a fierce verbal battle. The confrontation turned physical when Jason allegedly grabbed Susan by the neck and struck her. The violence of this moment marked a horrifying escalation in their troubled relationship, one that would have fatal consequences. The following morning, the hotel was rocked by a shocking discovery. Jason claimed he had awoken to find Susan unresponsive in the bathroom, her body hanging with a cord around her neck. The scene was chaotic as hotel staff and guests gathered, trying to make sense of the tragic turn of events. When police arrived, their initial assessment seemed to rule out foul play. Jason was not immediately considered a suspect, a decision that would later raise serious questions about the adequacy of police investigations in domestic violence cases. How could such a violent confrontation the night before not set off alarm bells? As the investigation unfolded, inconsistencies in Jason's account began to emerge. Mark Thompson, a colleague who attempted to administer CPR to Susan, noted several troubling details. Susan was completely naked, and the cord around her neck was loosely tied. Observations that didn't align with the typical characteristics of suicide. Jason's behavior in the aftermath of Susan's death also raised eyebrows. While chaos reigned around him, Jason remained unnaturally calm, a demeanor that struck many as odd given the circumstances. This, coupled with the physical evidence at the scene, began to paint a picture that contradicted the initial suicide ruling. Perhaps most damning was the timeline of messages exchanged between Jason and Jolene on the day of Susan's death. These communications suggested an ongoing relationship, directly contradicting Jason's claims of wanting to repair his marriage with Susan. As investigators dug deeper, a shocking truth began to emerge. The evidence increasingly pointed to a staged death scene, contradicting initial reports and revealing a much darker reality. Susan's body showed signs of being moved, and the circumstances surrounding her death were inconsistent with suicide. As the investigation into Susan Rhodes' death unfolded, Jason's carefully constructed story began to crumble. The inconsistencies in his account became too glaring to ignore. He claimed to have found Susan hanging in the bathroom, but the physical evidence told a different tale. The loose note around Susan's neck and the positioning of her body raised red flags for the investigators, but it wasn't just the crime scene that didn't add up. Jason's behavior in the aftermath of Susan's death struck many as odd. While chaos reigned around him, he remained unnaturally calm, a demeanor that seemed out of place for a man who had just lost his wife. Perhaps the most damning evidence came from Jason's phone. The sheer volume of communication between Jason and his mistress, Jolene, painted a picture of an ongoing affair rather than a relationship he was trying to end. Over 2,266 calls between February and July 2016 spoke volumes about the true nature of their connection. As these details came to light, the police could no longer ignore the possibility that Susan's death was not a suicide. Jason Rhodes was arrested, and the case that would captivate South Africa began to unfold. About 3,000 messages between the then 47-year-old parents of 3 teenage girls were handed in as evidence at Rhodes' murder trial in the High Court in Cape Town. They painted a picture of a woman overwhelmed by suspicion after her husband's affair with a colleague, and of a husband alternately appeasing and resenting his wife's constant need for reassurance. The 79 pages of messages end abruptly at 7:43 p.m. on Saturday, July 23, 2016. Early next morning, Susan was dead inside, and it was a month later when Rhodes was finally arrested. The legal proceedings that followed exposed troubling biases within the justice system. Susan's history of depression was initially used to support the suicide theory, highlighting how mental health struggles can be weaponized against victims of domestic violence. This raised important questions about how law enforcement and the courts handle cases involving mental health and domestic abuse. The trial itself was a grueling process, filled with shocking revelations and heartbreaking testimonies. Medical experts presented evidence that Susan's death was not consistent with suicide. Instead, they argued that she had been strangled and her death staged to look like hanging. Throughout the proceedings, concerns about bias against victims of domestic violence came to the forefront. Susan's previous calls for help and expressions of fear were not given the weight they deserved, highlighting a systemic failure to recognize and respond to warning signs of abuse. The case underscored the urgent need for better training for law enforcement and legal professionals in handling domestic violence cases. Too often, the signs of abuse are missed or dismissed, leaving victims vulnerable and without the protection they desperately need. After a lengthy trial, Jason Rhodes was found guilty of murder and obstruction of justice. The judge delivered a scathing verdict, describing Jason as a selfish, self-centered man who had killed his wife in a fit of rage. The court sentenced him to 20 years in prison, a decision that seemed to offer some measure of justice for Susan. However, the story didn't end there. In a twist that shocked many, Jason's sentence was later reduced to 15 years on appeal. The appellate court cited perceived errors in the initial trial as the reason for the reduction. This decision sparked outrage and reignited debates about the adequacy of sentencing in domestic violence cases. The reduction in Jason's sentence highlighted a troubling pattern in how the legal system often fails victims of domestic violence. It raised questions about whether the courts truly understand the devastating impact of these crimes and whether current sentencing guidelines are sufficient to act as a deterrent. Susan Rhodes' tragic story exposes deep flaws in our systems. Mental health support fell short when she needed it most. The signs of abuse were there, but overlooked. Law enforcement and the courts stumbled in their response to domestic violence. The impact of Susan's death ripples far beyond her immediate family. Her daughters lost their mother and must now grapple with their father's actions. This trauma will likely shape their lives for years to come. Susan's case is a wake-up call. It shows we need better early intervention, more accessible mental health resources, and increased awareness of domestic abuse signs. Her story reminds us there's still much work to do in protecting vulnerable individuals and preventing domestic violence. We must learn from these failures and push for meaningful change to prevent future tragedies.